first Canadian canola and soybeans and peas, and now beef and pork. China says it has found a banned feed additive in a pork shipment. This drug apparently banned not only in China but elsewhere. What does it mean for Canada's crucial pork exports? I mean, Japan and America are bigger markets, but China is important. We sold about $500 million worth of pork to that country last year. Beijing says export certificates were falsified. The federal government has acknowledged that there was a problem here. We're now joined by the International Trade Diversification Minister, Jim Carr. Minister, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks. It's good to be with you.
I know this is a breaking story at this stage. Information is still emerging. But do you feel this is linked to the tension over the detention of the Huawei CFO?
There is no way of knowing for sure. Somebody's falsifying Canadian export certificates. Someone thinks that there's an advantage in using the Canada brand to get into the Chinese market. It's a problem, and we're going to get to the bottom of it. We're working with provincial counterparts, with the industry officials involved, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and the Chinese themselves, so that we can come up with some idea of where this product comes from and how to determine who's falsifying these export certificates to get to the bottom of it.
Your colleague, the Agriculture Minister, Marie-Claude Bibeau, has said there is an issue involving inauthentic export certificates.
Right.
Do you have any indication, is this happening in Canada or in China?
There's evidence that it's happening from Canadian export certificates, but we don't know where the product originates. And we have to know that. We have to get to the bottom of it. You know that the most important interest is to keep people safe. We know that we have the best brand in the world. But somebody is trying to penetrate the Chinese market by falsifying Canadian certificates, and we're working with officials to investigate it and get to the bottom of it as fast as we can with our partners in the industry and in the provinces.
But are you saying this could be non-Canadian pork involved?
Yes.
Oh, I thought it was Canadian pork, but
no, it's a Canadian certificate, but we don't know the origin of the pork.
But it's not. It could be Canadian pork that does contain this additive.
We don't have the evidence of where the pork comes from. What we do know is that certificates have been falsified, so there will have to be an investigation to determine where that's originating and why and who's responsible.
But this feed additive is used in Canada. It's a growth promoter.
Yes, but we don't send it to markets where it's not permitted.
Right, yeah. I mean, isn't that a problem in itself, that we would be using an additive in Canada that's banned in other countries?
Well, other countries have different rules and regulations in the import of all kinds of products. It's not standardized throughout the world. And we understand that, and that's why we make very certain that we don't export commodities to other countries that may run afoul of their rules and regulations. And we believe we have not done that. Somebody is falsifying certificates.
Right, so it is possible that Canadian pork that contains this additive did enter the Chinese market.
We don't know for sure the origin of this product.
Oh, okay. Now, let's talk about something more cheerful. You're in town.
Sure.
Tell us while you're in town in Toronto.
Well, I was with the Canada-India Business Council this morning to talk about enhancing trade with India. Already there are more than 1,000 companies doing business in India. You know that diversification is of strategic importance to Canada. 75% of our exports go to one country, the United States. We want to expand that. We want to diversify that to other countries. And later on today, I'll be talking about the modernized Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement to build on an agreement that was signed in 1997. So it all plays into what the government believes to be in our interests in the long term, and that's to establish new markets and to encourage small and medium-sized businesses to export where they may not have exported before.
Of course, India, a huge taker of Canadian lentils and
Yes.
peas. We've had trouble with that relationship, though, over the past couple of years. They put on what some see as non-tariff barriers.
Right. Well, we look to deal with that. There's the election of a new government. We will continue the conversation. But there are many other commodities and many other industries where Canada and India already have a relationship. And we're looking not only to expand theirs, but to create new ones, including, by the way, in the exchange of students. We think that as we look generationally ahead, it's very important that more and more students from India come to Canada and vice versa. And we have established new investments to make sure that will happen. So on a whole variety of fronts, we look to broaden and deepen the relationship with India. And tonight, we'll be talking about the same thing with Israel.
With Israel? Well, that's interesting because I guess students are the business leaders of tomorrow, and if they've spent time in Canada, they're going to be familiar with companies here. Links will be built up.
Exactly, and there are tens of thousands of them. Many of them want to stay in Canada. Some do. Others go back home and take with them an understanding of Canada, its culture, its economy, its diversity, its values. So in every respect, it's good for us and it's good for them.
Now, I should actually, one thing I forgot to ask you, though, on what the Chinese embassy is saying. They seem to be pretty clear here that it did contain the additive and that it was exported from Canada. So China is directly alleging this was pork from Canada.
Well, it's a false certificate. So someone has forged a Canadian export certificate, so we have to determine where the product comes from and what's in it.
Are you worried that there could be corruption in the Canadian meat industry? And this
No, there's no evidence of that, and I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about somebody who's falsifying Canadian documents. And we want to protect our brand, which is the finest in the world, and we'll get to the bottom of it.
Let me just ask you one last question, just on these bans, and it applies to America as well. It seems to be that China is banning or restricting imports of commodities all the time. Why aren't we talking about Canadian sophisticated manufacturers going to China?
Well, we are, and the relationship with China is broad and deep. You know that we've got a problem with canola, and there is the allegation that there are impurities in our canola, and we seek to have a scientific exchange. But one of the companies involved signed their first wheat deal with the Chinese in 1910. What's the point? The point is we've been doing business for a long time with China. We're going through a difficult period. We want to get through the period, and we want to establish better relations with the world's second largest economy.
And just overall, then, I know you kind of avoided the question earlier, but you must have some insight.
I try not to avoid questions from you.
But the Huawei
You're such a straight-up journalist. I don't know why.
The Huawei CFO detention. What is how suspicious are you that this is behind these trade blockages?
There is no direct evidence of that. We're treating this as a technical issue. Other people will come to their own conclusions. We believe that we've got to get to the bottom of what this issue means for our producers, just as we have to continue to determine how we can reestablish more normal trading relationships with China.
Thank you very much, Minister.
It's my pleasure.
Our guest has been the International Trade Diversification Minister, Jim Carr.